want to welcome all of you who are worshiping with us online. If we haven't met, I'm Chip Freed, the lead teaching pastor here. Welcome to all of us who are in person today. I'm so glad Terry brought up the mission relief to the folks across the world. Our hearts have been in that. I got to tell you, there's a lot of screwed up things about being part of a denomination. We don't do very many things well sometimes, but I'll tell you one thing we do amazingly well is the mission work. The Methodist Church built more houses after Katrina than the federal government did. And it came because of giving from churches all across the country. I have one of my buddies serves the nom down in Arkansas, and he said, Chip, man, we raised $10,000 for Hurricane Katrina. I said, great, we raised $27.2 million. And I wasn't trying to be funny, but it was true. And so I hope you understand that as you give to the church, like I knew and Terry knew, we got up, we prayed for those victims, but the morning we woke up, we knew 12% of our giving was supporting UMCOR workers who were on the ground the minute the buildings fell. So that's a wonderful thing sometimes that we don't talk about enough for you to know, and second mile giving. We're also, well, as much as we care about this, I want you to cheer for this too locally. We're celebrating the ministry of Justin Mackey today. Some of you have only known him for a few weeks, I get that. You've only met him in December, but some of us have known him for over a decade, and we appreciate his giftedness. I remember when Justin first came to us, and believe me, much of what's happened here has his fingerprints all over it. But I remember when he first came here, he would say all the time, I want us to be a sent church. I want us to be a sent church. I want us to be a sent church. And what he meant was we come here, but we're sent out into the world. And you've done an amazing job sending people out. We've had drummers here that were sent out and became worship leaders. We've had youth pastors here that were sent out and became lead pastors. One of them is serving in Detroit, Michigan, in a very important place. And today, we're celebrating Justin sending himself out. And so we want to lay hands on him and we want to celebrate him. So whether you've known him for a while, whether you don't know him, just come by and say thank you. Because one of the greatest things, I wrote a little note to him in life, is to know you made a difference. And we think sometimes small differences. Well, in God's eyes, mustard seed things, can change the world. Amen? All right. So we're in our series, Love and Sex and Marriage. Last week, Scott kicked it off. He got the marriage card. I get the sex sermon. Okay, so I know where I stand. A few funny things happened on the way to this sermon. We do our social media, all our pastors in our church, and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter elsewhere. And, it's been out there that Chip's going to be preaching the sex sermon today. So I got an email from one of our older members in our heritage service. I got an Instagram message from a pastor who follows me, who's a little younger than I am. Probably by half, but anyhow, and I got a message from my wife this morning, those three things. The first, I got an email from a member of Heritage who said that they had recently, knew what I was preaching on, said they recently went to a Cavs game, and he, his son, and his grandson, now his son and his wife are expecting a third child. They have like a 10-year-old daughter, I think a 6 or 7-year-old son, and then expecting a third. So he said they were on their way down to Rocket Mortgage Field, and, mom's pregnant. And so on the way, his grandson, 6 or 7 years old, speaks to his son and says, Dad, how do babies get in mommy's bellies? And this person on the email said, I just couldn't wait to listen to what my son was going to say. And he said his son began to hem and haw. You've been there. Some of you have had kids at that age. And hem and haw and start to kind of explain things. And finally his grandson said, Dad, you don't have to make stuff up. If you don't know how to get there either, it's fine. I love that. And then this young pastor hit me up and he said his daughters are, I think, 8 and like 3. And he said one day his daughter came home from school. I guess they had their first instructions on sex or whatever. He said his daughter went up to him and said, Dad, I know how it happens. And he said, what, honey? What do you mean? I know how babies are born. And he said, great, honey. Do you want to go sit down at the table and we can talk about it? She said, no, I just want to know that you and Mom never did it. And he said, how do you think you got here? And she said, well, tell me you didn't do it more than twice. He said to his daughter, he said, no, honey, we looked at you, and after you were born, we decided never, ever to do it again. And then this morning, as I was leaving the house, I was getting my coffee before I was getting ready to come. My wife came in, just very gently said to me, she said, honey, how sometimes I tell you, not all the time, but sometimes you kind of talk about our marriage and you and I too much. I said, yeah, honey, I understand. She said, today would be a really good day to remember that. So those were my 3 things I got. See, it's a little awkward, isn't it, to talk about sex and sexual intimacy, especially in church. I mean, look, I had to make all these disclaimers. We would make an announcement, send out a mass email, talked about this morning. But the interesting thing is sex is talked about everywhere else. Every single venue, right? On the television, if you're watching the Super Bowl today, and you'll see advertisements, and some of them will be involved innuendos, and our children see that when they're very young. There's nothing I could do to shelter them from that. Commercials, billboards, magazines, Marketing 101 says this: sex sells. So it's out there a lot, but we get a little skittish in the church, but yet the Bible is not afraid or ashamed to talk about sex and sexual intimacy. We find it everywhere. And maybe we shouldn't be too. So we looked at Paul this morning. Paul was writing to a church at Thessalonica. That's a scripture that Terry read to you. Now, just a little Bible teaching. If you don't know, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are the oldest pieces of writing in the New Testament. Scholars don't agree on everything, but they 100% agree on that. This is a very young church. It's a very early church. And Paul is instructing these young, new Christians, not long after Jesus' death and resurrection, about how to wire down the gospel into all parts of their lives. And he says this, he says, we urge you, there it is, in the name of the Lord Jesus, to live in a way that pleases God. As we've taught you, you live this way already, and we encourage you what? To do so even more. Today's translation was more and more. So Paul says, yes, you're doing it, but never grow weary, one time he says, in doing good, and never grow weary in really bringing the gospel into all areas of your life. And he uses 3 illustrations. If you read on in that passage, sorry, I'm getting strangled here by myself. He uses 3 illustrations. He uses sex, he uses money, and he uses death. Those are 3 things most of us will experience in our lives. These are pretty basics, right? And he talks about that the gospel should show up in your life in these 3 areas. In fact, in death. Do you know in the Greco-Roman world, they were stunned by Christians because of the way they died? They tried to snuff out Christianity. They put them in the Colosseum. They fed them to lions. They did terrible things to kill them. And the Christians held hand in hand as families with the lions bearing down on them and sang hymns. One early bishop said, our people die well. And the world had never seen that before. And when it comes to, money and sex, one of the things I love, there was a writing that was by a person who wrote a letter to what's called Diognetus. And in that letter, he's talking about the Christian community. And watch what he says. He says, we share our table with all, but not our bed with all. That was absolutely the exact opposite how the Greco-Roman world did it. If you talked about Greco-Roman culture, they shared their bed with all, but not their table with all. See, in that day and age, they didn't share their table with all. They didn't share their wealth. They didn't share their goods. This is the first time the disparity of wealth started, was really in the Roman Empire. And because they were hoarders, and they didn't care if others didn't have, and they didn't do that. And they shared their bed with everybody. It was expected. I mean, I don't like what I have to tell you, but in that day and age, and it was men, right? Because women had absolutely no rights. So as my wife says, the inferior species that's ruined the world, they could have sex with everybody. It was expected. They had sex with women. They had sex with other men. This is just what they did. Every man was expected, in addition to a wife, to have a mistress that was an intellectual partner as well as a sexual partner, to have a concubine that was totally sexual, and to have one of your female servants that was just on call for this kind of thing. And if that wasn't bad enough, they went and hung out in the gymnasiums in that day and age, the boys-only sweat houses. They had sex with each other. They had teenage boy prostitutes. They had sex with them. Every single emperor had a teenage male prostitute. They did that. Then they went to the pagan temples where the women were forced to have sex with each other and all these horrible things, and the men watched, and they paid their money, and they went home to their wife and kids. That's what Romans 1:18 through 25 is talking about. That's the society, and Paul said that's an abomination, and I agree. And that was the community. We share our bed with all, but not our table with all. But Christians come in and say, no, this is the opposite. Sex is sacred and guarded. And boy, are we promiscuous with our money. And they spend it everywhere, and they give to anybody who had needs. And let me say something to you, that the pagan approach of sharing your sex with everybody and sharing your money with nobody destroyed that society. And there are social scientists that say in America and the West, we're way closer to the Roman Empire. And it may destroy ours too. What do you think our society is? Do we share our table with all, our goods, our money, but not our bed with all? Or do we share our bed with all and hoard and spend on ourselves? It's a good question. And so we have this. So I just want to talk about, what does the Bible say about sexual intimacy? Three big ideas. First, the Bible talks about the sacredness of sexual intimacy, the sacredness. And you get that right in the foundational story, in the story of creation. Whether you take that literally or whether you take it figuratively, you better take it seriously, because you can't explain the human race without it. And do you know at the climax of that, I knew this was going to happen. These words are going to come in off and on, and so keep score at home. Okay, at the pinnacle of the foundational story, truthfully, in Genesis 2:24 and 25, at the pinnacle of creation, it's a story about the gift of sexual intimacy. That's how the story of creation ends. Said they were together. Watch this. Listen to the language. In the Hebrew, they clung to one another. They were joined to one another. And the two became one flesh, united as one. They were both naked and not ashamed. The Hebrew literally there said they were naked and they felt no shame. And see, our Creator is not ashamed to put this story as the pinnacle at the end of the story of the human race, right? You know, now unfortunately, the church has missed this through the ages, and we create a sense that there's something dirty about this. I mean, the way God talks about, there's nothing dirty or tawdry or something to snicker at. This is sacred. It's holy. Look how it is, right? And the church through history has screwed this up. In fact, some church leaders through history have said that you shouldn't even have sexual intimacy unless you're having a child, which is so far from the biblical witness. And yes, the fact that creating another human being happens primarily through sexual intimacy. What does that say? That this is a moment we can be co-creators with God. This is something holy. It's something sacred, right? And the next thing is, sexual intimacy binds us together in covenantal relationship, in marriage, right? When they came together, they clung to one another, right? Because they were one flesh. It's capturing in physical form what was also happening psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. See, I wear this wedding ring, and if you, in our liturgy, when we're married, when Terry and I were married 33 years ago together, 35 years, but the pastor will take these rings and he'll say, these rings are a physical and outward sign of a spiritual and inward love and grace. Same thing with sexual intimacy. We're coming together, we're bound together, right? Saying that this is something that's happening between us, that's symbol of what's happening emotionally and spiritually. I don't know why this thing is driving me crazy. Okay, so even science backs this up. Okay, you always say, well, religion or science. Watch this. Even science backs this up, because physicians, scientists will tell us during sexual intimacy, two chemicals are released in the brain. The first one is oxytocin. The second one is vasopressin. Okay, oxytocin is the cuddle hormone. It's also released when women are breastfeeding. Why? Because it's building a connection, a link between the child and the mother. And in sexual intimacy and in marriages and relationships, the same thing is happening. The same hormone is binding us together. One medical journal said this: as oxytocin is released, it acts as emotional superglue between partners. Right? And vasopressin is also called a linking hormone, a binding hormone, and it creates a sense of protectiveness. When I work with youth sometimes, I talk about this binding. I get a piece of carpet, like a little square, and I get a piece of duct tape, and I put the duct tape on. I said, look, I push, I said, the duct tape is bound to the carpet, and then I rip it off. And I put it somewhere else. I said, now it's bound to the carpet, and I rip it off. I said, wow, there's all these particles and stuff hanging for it. But then I put it somewhere else, I push, and I rip it off. And I do that enough times, and pretty soon you pick up that duct tape, and it just falls to the floor. There's no stickiness left. And I didn't make that up. I got that from that same article that talked about oxytocin as a super glue. Watch what it says. It says, one way of thinking about this bonding effect is to imagine these hormones are like duct taping a couple's arms together. And after a breakup or after switching partners, that same duct tape is ripped off along with particles of skin and particles of hair, reducing its stickiness and ability to bond again. Similar to this research that suggests that when stress hormones are released, which usually happens at a breakup, the ability to create oxytocin is diminished. Research shows that oxytocin levels will increase to normal if sexual activity is stopped and time is given for emotional and physical healing. Now imagine that the duct tape was never removed, ever. The adhesion and thus the bonding of the partners would remain strong. In faithful marriage, for example, that oxytocin and vasopressin biologically increase the bond over and over and over again. Okay, the third thing that the Bible says about sexual intimacy is that sexual intimacy reveals and makes known. The Hebrew word there is yada, right? So you've heard that in Genesis 4:1, Adam knew Eve and she conceived a child, right? I know, it's yada. You remember Seinfeld years ago? Well, some of you are my age, like yada, 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 remember? You know what that means? I know. But yada means more than just I know. It means to see, it means to be revealed, it means to know and understand in very deep ways. And see, being physically naked before another is to reveal yourself whole and holy, but once again, that is only a symbol of what's happening emotionally and spiritually as we're revealing to each other, as we're making known to one another, okay? And it's not just seeing each other physically naked, that's simply symbolic. It's about really a deeper awareness and knowing and revealing to one another in a covenant, lifelong relationship. Okay, so these are the three things to remember. Sexual intimacy is sacred. It's awesome in power. It's a moment where we can co-create with our Creator. It's an idea of being bound together deeper and more profoundly than we can possibly imagine. And it's an idea of revealing ourselves to another and seeing them in a way that we and they are both fully known. How many of you were taught that in Sunday school growing up? I wasn't. This would have really helped me, right? But you don't talk about it. And so what happens? We go and figure it out on our own. And just like Adam and Eve, when they rejected God, we screw up the world. This needs to be talked about, okay? The challenge today is that our society doesn't understand any of these meanings, and probably because we have not had the courage to talk about it. So we talk about hooking up and friends with benefits, right? And here's how it goes, right? I go out on a first date, and we have a wonderful dinner, and then I say, well, let's go be intimate, right? And so we take all this power that God's intended, and I'm going to reveal my most intimate being to you. I'm going to be bound to you. I'm going to know you all the way down, and I've known you for all of 6 hours. Okay? And now I'm going to be one with you? Because we cheapen and trivialize it, we created what it's been robbed for, okay? And listen, I get this, you say, well, Chip, no, sexual intimacy until marriage, obviously no sexual intimacy outside marriage, but wait until your marriage. I mean, I've had teenagers, I've had some of you, all of us. I mean, listen, I'm not trying to be judgmental. I understand the times. I know the times we live in, but, and Paul said it this way in Romans 3:23, we all fall short of God's glorious standard. And thank God, God has got a grace, right? But shouldn't we know the glorious standard? Because even if we're married or we're in a relationship and maybe we've blown it, but we want to understand kind of what the intention was and live toward that, and you can do that married, unmarried, whatever. The biblical idea was this, okay? 2 people make a covenant with each other, so whether in sickness and in health, whether poor or rich, whether right now while you're at your physical peak and beautiful, yeah, you know what I mean. I didn't always look like this. I got pictures to prove it. Oh, she's looking at me really bad. Okay, she knows. But whether you're at your physical peak or whether you get older and you get wrinkles and your hair starts to fall out and you put on a few pounds, I'm going to love you. And I'm going to stay with you. And I'm going to be with you. I'm going to care for you. And all these things that are happening physically are reminding us what's happening emotionally and spiritually, and it can enrich and deepen us over time. And before we throw out that whole idea, right, we say, well, that's corny, that's antiquated. It was interesting. In 2010, there was a psychological survey done of 2,000 married couples. And do you know what? They published it. Now, most of those couples confessed that they had not waited until, they had made their covenant to be intimate. But for those who did, those who waited, we think, oh, come on, probably amateurs, right? Didn't get training. Watch what happened. It said that those who had waited until marriage rated the stability of their marriage 22% higher than those who hadn't. Isn't that interesting? They reported 20% higher increases levels of relationship satisfaction, 12% higher in communication, and watch this, 15% higher rating in their sex life. So maybe there's something to be said for those who fumble and bumble around and figure it out together, right? And so we recognize this, that this has a power. So we're going to do some real practical things right now. I'm going to go just a little bit longer, but Terry said I have till 6:30. She did. I heard her. Well, 6, because you got to get home. But there's a church I know, a very large church. They're not a flaming liberal church. They're not a conservative evangelical church. They're kind of mega mainline and very centrist people. But they did a survey of 5,177 church folk. Some there, some around. Folks that their qualification was had to at least go to church once a week and say that they pray regularly. That's a pretty low bar in some ways. But they did this survey and they asked questions, about 3,400 of which were married. And they came up with a rating on sexual satisfaction. So we just want to talk about this, guys. I think we can eliminate some mix. So here's the survey here. If you notice that, you have it over here. Here is people in their 20s, right? And they are, male, female. We're talking just this, how they responded based on their gender. And what was interesting is we think in your 20s, which are obviously you're at your physical sexual peak, that everybody, I thought in my 20s, married couple was having sex 365 days a year. And I reminded my wife of that like every other week. And you find out that's not true. 25% of married couples in their 20s are dissatisfied with their sexual life. Now watch what happens when you hit the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Dissatisfaction goes through the roof, particularly amongst men. Did you hear me say the inferior species a little bit earlier? They hear about what's going on, right? And actually, as that goes from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that number of dissatisfaction of men hovers around 55%. Dissatisfaction. Why the big jump between the 20s and the 30s? Anybody have any ideas? Why the big jump of dissatisfaction between 20s and 30s? Children. We're having children and are working on our careers. And we're worn out, right? People say, I'm just tired, I'm worn out, I don't have anything left to give. There's little comments in this survey, I read them all, and there was a 40-year-old husband that said, frankly, we're just too pooped to whoop. I like that, right? And the frequency begins to decline, and frustration begins to decline. And you'll notice this. Now, look, it actually peaks at the age of 40. It comes down a little bit in 50s. Look what it does in the 60s, and then the 70s. And if I go down to the 80s, dissatisfaction. In fact, the 80s have the highest satisfaction. I'm just going to tell you. Facts don't lie. And we'll talk about that, right? So what I like to say to people, if you're in here, if you're in your 30s and your 40s, and you're frustrated right now, it gets better. Hang in there. Hold on. All right? They said also a couple things. I read some therapists, and there's one, David Schnark, and he's wrote Intimacy and Love, and it's a very intense book, but I had to prepare to do this. And he said to that in every relationship, there's a high desire partner and there's a low desire partner. And none of them have equal. I mean, even if it's marginal, whatever. Somebody's a high desire, somebody's a low desire. And so if you have these kind of things, if you've ever had in your marriage, or your kids are having this in their marriage, where somebody says, why is this all you ever want? Can't you just cuddle with me? Can't you hold me? Can't we just rub feet? That's the low desire language. You know what the high desire language is? I'm just guessing. I've heard about this. The high desire language is, why do you never want to do this? Am I not desirable to you anymore? Don't you love me? See, you never had those conversations. I'm the only one that has. Okay. But this is, he said here, 4 things. If this happens to you, 1, you're normal. It's normal. This is not, you're not like, my marriage is in trouble. No, every marriage is in trouble, right? You have to work at it. Everything that's any good requires effort. And secondly, he said, you need to learn the art of compromise. You need to dance together. If one partner says, hey, it'd be okay if we were intimate once a month, and the other one says, well, I want 5 times a week, you got to find a way to talk about and dance together, right? And realize you're going to work at this because it's a very important part of relationships. And thirdly, you know what the other reason the frustration occurs, he says, with high desire, low desire? Boredom. If you do the same thing for 30 years, you're going to get bored. True story. I just read a story on Valentine's Day where couples said when they go away on a vacation, sometimes they come back with just a renewed commitment to their marriage, new ideas on life. What happened? You broke the routine. And doing what's appropriate within marriage is important. It should be fun and playful and pleasurable and having conversation. And fourthly, this is my favorite, realize it's not always going to be a wow. It's not always going to be a 10. Sometimes it's going to be a 1. I wish somebody had told me that too 40 years ago. But anyhow, it's true. It's not always going to be that. And one person compared it to a gourmet meal. Like, do you want to have a 5-course gourmet meal? That's wonderful. I mean, it's great to do that. But if you do it at home, what does that require? You got to think about the menu. You got to go to the store and get all the ingredients. You got to take hours and hours to prepare. Are you understand the metaphor? Yeah, okay. But sometimes it won't be a 5-course meal. Sometimes it'll be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It will. And the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are fine. Once in a while, you can have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's quick, it's fast. Oh my God. It's nutritious. But that's how it works. It's okay sometimes to have a 1, okay? It's not always a 10. Sometimes it'll be a gourmet meal. Sometimes it'll be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Why do I feel like you guys are just leaving me out here today? Just saying. Okay, boo. I'm getting booed too. Great. The women are cheering, the men are booing. I get it. I heard it. Okay. So let's look at some of the realistic expectations when it comes to this. We looked at frequency, right, in all the various age groups. Okay, so here's 20s, right? So those who said that they were sexually intimate couples at least 3 or more times weekly. Like when I was growing up, I thought this was everybody. It's about 11%. Okay? Twice weekly, 22%. Weekly is the largest. That's the largest, about 35%. I wouldn't have thought that when I was in my 20s. That it mostly is weekly, right? Very few or almost none, less than monthly or never. Now watch when we go to 30s, right? 30s, 20s, 30s, 20s. 30s. Just want you to just trying to get you focused, right? 3 times weekly has now dropped in half. It's gone from 11% to 5%. Twice weekly has dropped, okay? Weekly's dropped a little bit. Twice monthly has increased, okay? What happened again? We said children, careers, I'm tired. But guess what? Frustration levels begin to go up in this group, okay? So now let's watch what happens in the 40s. I love doing this with some of y'all. Somebody's elbowing each other out there, I know. There's 40s, right? 40s, 30s, 40s, 30s, 40s, right? 40s, a very, very little difference in 3 times a week, 2 a week, weekly. Things have kind of stabilized. Weekly has increased, right? But not because twice monthlies or twice monthlies are going down to weekly, but twice weekly are starting to go up to weekly, okay? And the nevers have now doubled. And somebody is just losing it out there. This is not stand-up comedy. This is science, okay? And you know that it's at this age in the 40s that sexual dissatisfaction reaches its peak. Okay, reaches its peak. So now watch what happens in the 50s, okay? 50s, 40s, 50s, right? And in the 50s, what's happened? Weekly has increased, okay? And twice weekly's declined. Few more monthly. Most have gone now. The biggest growth is less than monthly now in the 50s, okay? And what's happening here? When you look at the surveys, things like discomfort, menopause has made, sex more difficult, or prostate cancer, or that's what you're hearing. But what's interesting, as the frequency has gone down, the satisfaction has gone up. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so let's go to 60s, okay, 60s, 50s, 60s, okay. 60s, in the 60s, all levels through monthly, all of these have declined. Okay, now in the 60s, they've declined, but I want you to notice this, that from here over in the 60s, my writing's terrible. 82% of people in their 60s are still reporting having sexual intimacy some of the time. Okay, so it's just good to know that. 82% of couples are still doing that. Now let's head to the 70s, and again, satisfaction level is climbing enormously from the 50s to the 60s. Okay, so we go to the 70s, okay, 70s. The 70s is really interesting. Interestingly, 3 times a week has taken a bump in the 70s, which gives me great hope. Thank you for all of you in the 70s. That is just amazing. Way to go, 70s. But 15% of people are still intimate once a week, right here, 15%. And 85, where am I here? And still, trying to get here, 72% of people in their 70s are still intimate and sexual intimacy at least some of the time. Watch what happens in the 80s. Ready? Watch what happens. Right? 3 times is gone, twice weekly is gone. Weekly's about 7%, down to 4% for twice monthly. Monthly stays the same. Monthly has stayed the same almost throughout, okay? But 63% are no longer having what we consider sexual intimacy. But let me tell you what, satisfaction of sexual intimacy is at an all-time high. And what do we learn from that? When you listen to these couples that talk about in their 80s, they say sexual intimacy is not everything we've been told it's been. Sometimes it's touch, sometimes it's laughter, sometimes it's sharing with one another. And we have to learn a lot about that, right? Because when you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s, sex is a huge deal, right? Sexual activity, intimate sexual activity. But Terry and I'll never forget, we have a little pillow in our house. When we were small, when we first got here, and this service was like 40 people, and we were in here, and we could do some house calls a little more frequently. We still do, but we called on this elderly couple, and her husband died, I think, my first 6 months here, and they were a wonderful married couple. And every time Terry would go or I'd go, or we go together, we spied this little pillow on her couch, and she passed away 2 years later. They didn't have any children, so the executor of her estate brought it to my office, and there was a little but safety pin on it with a note, "This is for Chip and Terry," because she noticed we honored it. You know what it says on that pillow? "Come grow old with me. The best is yet to come." And this data proves that. And now we're a couple decades down the road. Okay, so what can we learn from some of this? Some quick tips. I'm going to wrap this up. Some quick tips. What we learn from this data is what happens with people who are sexually intimate 19 to 59 at least twice a week. That's pretty good standard, right? You know what we found out in this? And these are all church folk. We found out, did this die on me, Dave? I'm trying. Oh, there we go. It's back to that thing. 71% of the people who responded to that go on a date at least monthly. That was double the rest. 80% of them attend worship regularly. What does that mean? I don't know. But it's proven what the Bible said, that there's something between sexual intimacy and spiritual intimacy that somehow are connected. Okay, 57% of them said they spend 30 minutes or more per day in conversation than those who are less sexually intimate, which you think goes together, right? The more you converse with one another, the more sexually intimate you may be, the more sexually intimate you may be, the more you converse with one another. And this was actually triple the amount that those who were experiencing less intimacy in their marriage. And then finally, those who said they pray together daily were twice as likely to be intimate 2 times a week. So I don't know about this, friends, but I do think it reminds us that sexual intimacy is a gift from God, and it is a gift to model what's happening spiritually. What did Jesus say? I am the bridegroom, you are the bride. God is looking for this kind of intimacy with each and every one of us. And I know that makes us uncomfortable. Well, read the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. When people wander away from God, do you know what God accuses them? You know what sin he accuses them of? Adultery. You've committed adultery. Your eyes are on something more than me. You're looking to touch something more than me. You're looking to love something more than me. You're wandering away from me in my intimacy, okay? So I hope this helps you. I hope you find it helpful. This is a gift from God. It represents the super glue, things that will help us in our marriage, bind together, know one another. And it also represents, though, a deeper, truer grace of what's happening with us psychologically and emotionally and spiritually. I want to close with this. There was one woman who reported in her survey that they were 69, and she was just getting ready to move into the 70s. And she shared that they're in the nevers. They're in the nevers, right? And this is what she wrote. Though health issues have made this impossible for us now, there are still many ways for us to physically express our love. Many, many hugs and kisses, loving looks, and we flirt with each other all of the time. We fell deeply in love, and we know that while sexual intimacy is a joyous part of marriage, it's not the only measure of deep love. We are still diving deeper every day, and we've yet to reach the bottom of the sea. I love that. So I think what God intends is that sexual intimacy is a part of our life. It's meant to bless us. It's meant to help us bless each other. Sexual intimacy is not the only thing we've been taught to think. It's not the only way we've been taught to think it is. It's tender touch, it's romantic conversation, it's laughter. And these are the things, if we nurture them, will help us build a love that will last a lifetime. That's my theme for next week. Let's pray. Hey, God, we're thankful for us mining your scriptures and realizing that when we don't speak and we don't reflect and we don't think, it's so easy for us to wander away from what you've intended for our lives. Thank you for all the gifts you give us, gifts to build up community, to build up marriages, to build up covenant partnerships, to build up friendships, to build up families together. God, help us to be aware. Help us not to be ashamed to talk about, because when we do that, you said people will wander off to and fro, blown around by every doctrine. But your doctrine is grace and peace and wholeness and love. As the old song used to say, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. In Jesus' name, amen.